Questions and comments. Resuming debate, the honourable member for Calgary Centre.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and I appreciate being able to get up and speak on this motion that the NDP has put forward here. But I was drafting my speech, and I had to look at my speech and say, where do I start here today? Because you look at the actual motion here, and what the motion is asking for is to say Canadians pay, the preamble in it, Canadians pay about $2 per litre for gas right now. True, they do. Okay. Number two, oil and gas companies are making record profits. Let's analyze that. Let's analyze what that actually says and what it actually means. Canada spends 14 times more on financial support than it does for renewable energy. That's complete hogwash. And that part I'll address first of all, because the preamble itself is a mulch of misinformation. And the NDP is very good at that. The NDP is very good at putting misinformation on the table and saying, here's what's going to happen here, and repeating and repeating and repeating a narrative that is completely false. So I tried to participate last week at an event, a forum where my colleague that put this motion forward actually hosted. And I noticed that my party was the only party that wasn't invited to that forum. And that's because the other parties in this House have members that buy into this nonsense narrative about the way the transition happens. Now, my party and I have very good ideas about how we actually transition and decarbonize our economy, all of which are based on reason and outcomes, none of which I've seen from the Liberals, none of which I've seen from the Bloc, nor the NDP, nor the Green Party. Getting somewhere on the environmental equation is essential, and none of the other parties have presented anything that advances the environmental equation for the world. All it does is kneecap the Canadian industry. So I did some research after that forum, and I went to look for where does this 14 times subsidy in Canada for our oil and gas industry come from compared to what we fund for our alternative energy industry. And it comes from a group called Oil Change International, which is a proxy organization for Greenpeace, where its leadership comes from, for Friends of the Earth. It's funded by Tides organization. So again, a splash of the same voices producing louder and louder and more dissonant narratives around how we actually decarbonize the world. And frankly, and I'll take your license on this, Madam Speaker, you might have to slap me here, it is a lie. And it is something that this misinformation is based upon, and frankly needs to be called out for what it is whenever we see it here as parliamentarians, because our job here is to speak the truth and only the truth. And when we actually foment misinformation by repeating what are lies on the internet, we are actually going towards that confirmation bias that we buy into and that our people buy into. Get the real facts on the table here. Ignore these groups like Oil Change International that are just rent seekers putting money in their pockets at the expense of Canadians, I should say. So I actually asked if there was actually...
Sorry, I have a point of order. The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Yes, Madam Speaker, I followed the member for Calgary Centre as closely as I could. He expected to have his wrist slapped, but if I understood him correctly, he called this motion from one of the honourable members in this place a lie, which is the same as saying that the honourable member for Victoria is a liar, unless I misheard him. Perhaps he can clarify.
I believe that the honourable member, when she's asking for clarification, is actually more a point of debate. I do want to remind members to be judicious on the words that they are selecting, and I'll allow the honourable member to continue with his speech. The honourable member for Calgary Centre. A point of order, the honourable member for Calgary Rocky Ridge.
I wanted to speak to the point of order that was raised, and to be clear, I was listening too, and I don't think that there's any reason why the member for Calgary Centre should have expected to have his wrist slapped at all. We're talking about he did not call any member of this chamber a liar, but brought to the attention that lies are repeated. And that's a
I've actually ruled that this was not a point of order. Now it's becoming more of a point of debate. And the honourable member mentioned himself that, he thought maybe he might get his wrist slapped, which I didn't do because of the way that it was said, so I just want to indicate that, what's going on right now is more points of debate. The honourable member of Calgary Centre.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And it's the first time I've used that word in this House, so I was wondering if it was actually a usable word in this House or was a three-letter word that actually disguised as a four-letter word. But thank you for the clarification. And yes, the information being fomented by Oil Change International is a lie. And I will repeat that in this House because it is the truth. But let's go back to the analysis here. Let's look at the real numbers. I'm looking at the oil and gas industry and how much it's contributed to Canada over the last 21 years. $505 billion. That's more than $500 billion. It's given an economic rent to governments across Canada. $505 billion. That's a number even in the real Liberal world when they run their deficits. But let's look at what that buys, actually. That buys how much health care? That buys how much schooling? That buys how much old age security? That buys the lifestyle that Canadians have enjoyed for decades here in Canada, thanks to a prosperous natural resource industry led by Canada's oil and gas industry. $128 billion is how much we actually, it's a GDP number here we have, and $120 billion is our trade surplus in the oil and gas industry. Actually it's balanced by about $30 billion of imports, so about a $90 billion surplus we're talking about for this industry. But 522,000 jobs. And I know that the NDP would like to see those 522,000 workers with their legs cut out for them and actually not being able to provide for their families. But I don't think they actually understand the impacts that has on families, because that impact that has on families.
We have a point of order. The honourable member for New Westminster Burnaby.
Madam Speaker, as you know, when we speak in this House, we have to have at least some connection with the truth. And the member is straying far from any semblance of relying on the truth here.
So I will, unfortunately, I had my focus somewhere else at the moment. At the time, I will have to review what the honourable member have said and come back to decide whether or not this is an actual point of order. I do want to remind the members that when they are debating, that they make sure that what they're saying is relevant, and hopefully that the honourable members are providing factual information. The honourable member of Calgary Centre.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. And it's the first time that anybody in the NDP has actually challenged me on the truth, because the motion itself they put on the table here is riddled with misinformation. Right. So let's get to the heart of the matter here. 522,000 jobs. Do you realize the cost when you lose 522,000 jobs in Canada? It'll be devastating for families across this country, and there'll be no longer any social support provided through that industry that funds our country more than any other industry in Canada right now. So $20 billion, my colleague pointed out, was supplied by this industry to economic rent to governments across Canada last year alone, and not that prosperous a year for oil and gas companies in Canada. And $20 billion would be in addition to the $52 billion deficit, plus, of course, all the economic dislocations that would happen if we actually tried to change this industry more than it's actually already changing itself. Now, industry has its own job to do, and it's doing it very well. I'm going to move here to course where we're actually looking at this whole notion of profitability. There's a thing called the reinvestment ratio. And when this government came to power, the reinvestment ratio, that is the amount of money the oil and gas companies were spending to drill and develop new resources versus the amount they're actually paying back, was 1.82. That means for every dollar that they earned, they put $1.82 back in the ground to develop for future resources for Canada, a development industry. That number now, Madam Speaker, you'd be surprised, is actually down to 0.29. So 29% of the money that comes from the industry actually gets put into development. That's because there's no line of sight on what happens to their money in the future. And that's the result of extremely poor policies from this government. So there is no line of sight. And yes, the government's had to step in and buy infrastructure that should have been built by private sector, but their policies punished those private sector organizations by saying, how do we invest in a country where there is no line of sight on how we actually earn money on our investment? Government investment is fine. Private sector investment actually looks to make sure it actually gets return on its investment. The concept I know most of my colleagues in all four parties in this House have almost no concept about return on investment. And that's required around the world, not just in Canada. But let's talk about the environment a little bit. Let's talk about carbon capture, because my colleagues here will know it's one of my premier pieces about how we actually decarbonize this world. And somebody referenced the International Energy Agency. Well, the International Energy Agency, international organization, of course, says that 7% of our decarbonization will come from carbon capture, utilization, and storage over the next 20 years. 7% is not enough. Let's find more ways to decarbonize this industry. And you think about the methane reductions in Canada, we lead the world on our environmental practices and how we're actually getting to a better environmental outcome for the world. This industry's production of hydrocarbons, it's down 30% in its carbon intensity over the last 15 years. That leads every Canadian industry in its decarbonization. That leads every country in the world as far as their oil and gas industries go. And the only two countries we need to compare ourselves with in this regard are the United States and Norway. Our only two peers. We're far better than the United States, and we're on par with Norway, both of whom have better carbon capture regimes than we do. We need to do better and make sure that our environmental practices match the most advanced countries in the world. We need to be the most advanced country in the world on these decarbonization initiatives. Now, Madam Speaker, I'm going to deviate now because I think in the spirit of productivity and actually working with my colleagues across the aisles, I'm going to propose an amendment to this bill where we add at the bottom, after B, we add C. The Government of Canada identifies and eliminate inefficient energy industry subsidies by 2023. It should clearly identify, quantify, and phase out programs for the Canadian energy sector that subsidize compliance with existing regulations. 1, or I, inefficient subsidies shall be deemed as those government grants or payments below market provisions of capital, contracts for difference, social financing, unequal capital cost allowance allocation differentials, trade access program funding, expenditures to reduce, delay taxation, such as flow-through financing mechanisms as provided by all levels of government. 2, further, inefficient shall be interpreted to mean the incentives granted under such programming shall result in less funds being provided to all levels of government as a result of the programming. That is, the economic rent received by the various levels of government must be less than that received had the subsidy not been implemented. 3, in addition, as energy is an essential input to society and human development, and the source of the energy is fungible with respect to its social utility, that common measurements be applied across all energy sources that receive any government subsidies or programming from all levels of government. Common comparison elements must include full cycle costing, including purchase and disposition of capital equipment, and common depreciation schedules, capital cost allowance rates, and accredited capital costs. A level comparison of costs and benefits is essential to determining relative efficiency of subsidization. And 4, such inefficient allocation of government resources shall not be applied to programming that aims to attain societal objectives beyond the aim of sourcing safe, secure, affordable energy for Canadians. Specifically, programming applied for scientific advancements in environmental technologies to better the outcomes.
Sorry, I think there's a problem with interpretation, probably. The honourable député de Shefford.
Présidente, je tiens juste à rappeler que l'interprète a nommé qu'elle n'avait pas reçu l'amendement du député. Donc, au départ, elle a eu de la difficulté aussi au niveau de la traduction. Donc,
Okay. So it seems that the interpretation didn't get a copy of the amendment ahead of time. So there's, I would just ask maybe the honourable member to slow down. Est-ce qu'on doit recommencer pour avoir...
Je recommencerai avec numéro 4. Such...
Une seconde. Il va recommencer avec numéro 4. Non. Si l'honorable député peut commencer numéro 4, ça serait bien.
Such inefficient allocation of government resources shall not be applied to programming that aims to attain societal objectives beyond the aim of sourcing safe, secure, affordable energy for Canadians. Specifically, programming applied for scientific advancements in environmental technologies to better the outcomes of energy sources are, by design, inefficient, particularly at early stages of development, which is when government action through programming is most importantly applied to derive better societal outcomes. So it's an amendment that's meant to kind of allow the government the ability to fund these new environmental technologies that are always more expensive for industry at the front end, and actually continue to kind of compare a base level about what is a subsidy in this industry versus these other industries where the government's shoveling money out the door right now to try and say this is more important for us than others. So I'm hoping that
the honourable member can table his motion or his amendment, but to elaborate on it is a point of debate. And I do want to remind the member and all members in the House, if they have something in writing, whether it's their speech or whether it is amendments or motions, that it's always best to ensure that interpretation has access to that they provide that to the interpretation in order to ensure that every member in the House is fully aware of what is being said. And so just wanted to remind that. And I'm just they're going to go and pick up the amendment, and we'll be right back. Little break here for a second. It is my duty to inform honourable members that an amendment to an opposition motion may be moved only with the consent of the sponsor of the motion, or in the case that he/she is not present, consent may be given or denied by the House Leader, the Deputy House Leader, the Whip, or the Deputy Whip of the sponsor's party. Since the sponsor is not present in the House, in the chamber, I don't think, I ask the NDP House Leader if he consents to this amendment being moved. The honourable member for New Westminster Burnaby.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's another muddled mess of an amendment from the Conservatives, so no, we do not agree.
Resuming debate. Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? Questions and comments? The honourable member for New Westminster Burnaby.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I always enjoy listening to the member from Calgary Centre. This time, though, it was so unrelated to the facts that it was quite unbelievable, Madam Speaker. Here we have a situation where we know we're talking about $8.6 billion in subsidies last year alone, record profits in the oil and gas sector, and at the same time people being gouged to the pumps, and the Conservatives don't seem to recognize any of those realities. Madam Speaker, as you well know, I come out of the oil industry, worked at the Shelburne Oil Refinery in Burnaby, British Columbia. I've also worked in social enterprise, won a number of business awards. Understand return on investment, but when Canadians are investing $8.6 billion in subsidies, and we're seeing the increasing cost of climate change now reaching billions of dollars a year that impact Canadians right across the country. Why do Conservatives continue to deny the reality of climate change? Why do they continue to deny the reality of subsidies? Why do they deny the reality of the important issue that is before the House today?
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Calgary Centre.
Well, I appreciate that my colleague asked a question there, although it was a bunch of hyperbole. Let me respond very adroitly. And I will say to the member, 8.6 billion is not a subsidy number provided. And if he wants to understand the definition of what a subsidy is, perhaps he can look it up before he comes in this House and accuses me of an ad hominem like not believing in climate change. That was a ridiculous comment, and he should stand down immediately.
Questions and comments. The honourable parliamentary secretary. We have the honourable member for Timmins James Bay on a point of order.
Well, I don't want to challenge the Conservatives on whether they believe climate change, but I think he should get some better acting skills if he's going to pretend he believes in climate change.
I will tell the honourable member for the honourable parliamentary secretary to the government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. And I think it is worthy of noting that there are members within the Conservative Party, even within the leadership of the party, where there is a serious concern in terms of just climate change deniers. And that's just a reality. It might not necessarily be the member that just spoke, but it is an issue within the Conservative Party. My question to the member is that, can he explain to the House, why is it when the Conservatives were in administration, the Government of Canada, for 10 years, that they failed in getting resources to tidewaters, whether it's on either one of the coasts in terms of pipelines?
For Calgary Centre.
Hi, Madam Speaker, I'm not here to litigate what happened over 10 years ago. I do know that many pipelines were built. A handful of pipelines were built in the previous administration. Contrary to what the Prime Minister puts on the floor of this House of Commons, which is complete misinformation again, which is allowed in this House, it seems, which surprises me and surprises my constituents. So I will tell the member across that asked the question that if he wants to actually look at what's being built in Canada right now, tell me why TMX is taking so long to get built. Because of irregularity of process that his government has introduced in actually getting projects built in Canada. That's why we have capital fleeing Canada. That's why projects don't get built here. That's why there is no investment from private capital. Thank you very much.
Questions et commentaires, l'honorable député de Drummond.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. J'espère que le collègue de Calgary Centre n'a pas pris ombrage de ma petite boutade tout à l'heure. J'ai adoré écouter son discours. J'en ai presque pas manqué une seconde. Madame la Présidente, les collègues conservateurs parlaient tout à l'heure des milliards que l'industrie pétrolière redonnait à la société. Et on entend aussi parler de l'extraordinaire rentabilité de ce secteur. Or, effectivement, et on peut le voir, là, le premier trimestre de l'année 2022 montre des profits records pour les pétrolières au Canada. Et pendant ce temps-là, les consommateurs paient à la pompe des taxes faramineuses et paient ensuite, même leurs taxes et leurs impôts, des subventions faramineuses à cette industrie. Alors, ma question est toute simple pour le collègue. C'est une question très, très, très facile à répondre. Est-ce que ce ne serait pas mieux à ce moment-là de réduire les subventions, quitte à les annuler complètement? À mon sens, ce serait peut-être la meilleure chose à faire, mais pour redistribuer cet argent-là en aide aux citoyens, aux Québécois, aux Canadiens, qui en arrachent particulièrement avec la hausse du prix de l'essence, mais avec l'inflation qui ne cesse d'augmenter et avec les conséquences que le prix de l'essence aura sur l'économie en général. Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Voilà. L'honorable député de Calgary West.
Je suis bien d'accord avec mon ami qui a demandé la question. C'est très important de reconnaître que la hausse de prix d'essence récente est en cause partiellement de le coût de la taxe de carbone qui est impliquée par le gouvernement fédéral, maintenant les libéraux. Maintenant, on disait beaucoup de fois de dire c'est un temps maintenant de réduire, de délai la taxe de carbone sur le consommateur de Canada. Ça coûte presque 1200 en total maintenant pour la taxe de carbone pour le consommateur canadien.
Prise du débat.